Good evening. How are you all doing tonight? Excellent. My name is Joel Westfall. I am the Deputy Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. It is my great honor to welcome you not only on behalf of the National Archives and Records Administration, but also on behalf of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Our relationship, National Archives' relationship with the World Affairs Council goes back almost 20 plus years. It began by our former education lead, Barbara McGregor, well over 20 plus years ago. And that relationship has continued and expanded, and the foundation came in and also became a huge partner with World Affairs. And this is a partnership we value each and every year, whether it's the National Archives or it's the foundation, valuing this opportunity to host programs like this at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. This is exactly the type of programming that both Betty and Jerry, or Jerry and Betty, depending on how you like to put it, would have loved to see here at their museum. And thank you for being here. Now I would like to introduce Erica from the World Affairs Council.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight. We're here for our 2026 8-week Great Decisions series with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association, and tonight's program is the fourth in the series. So I hope you've been enjoying it if you've come to some events, and I hope you enjoy the program tonight and come to our remaining events in March. As Joel said, I'm Erica Kubik. I'm the Director of Programming for the Council, and on behalf of my colleagues, Rachel Brooks, Abigail Stead, Michael Van Denen, and the Board of Directors of the Council, thank you for coming tonight. We're pleased to host the Great Decisions series at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, and deeply grateful to the museum staff and to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for this partnership and support. And thank you as well to the museum and GRCC video teams for its expertise enabling our program to be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. So if you enjoy the program tonight, please share it with all of your friends when it becomes available online. It's our mission to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world, and to change the world, we believe one must first know the world. So you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. We also express our appreciation to WGVU Public Media as a presenting media sponsor, and to the Community Media Center as communication partner. And finally, we especially want to give a shout out to Dr. Mike DeVivo, Professor of Geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and to all our partners at GRCC, as well as the American Association of Geographers, the International Geographical Honor Society, and the City of Holland for giving extra assistance for this program tonight. And now I'm gonna have Dr. Mike DeVivo come up and introduce Dr. Moseley.
Geography lives. Dr. William G. Moseley is Dewitt Wallace Professor of Geography and Director of the Food, Agriculture, and Society Program at Macalester College, St. Paul, Minnesota. He is the author of more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, as well as 11 books, including most recently, Decolonizing African Agriculture, Food Security, Agroecology, and the Need for Radical Transformation. Africa's Green Revolution, Critical Perspectives on New Agricultural Technologies and Systems, and Land Reform in South Africa, an Uneven Transformation. Dr. Moseley graduated with a bachelor's degree from Carleton College and holds master's degrees in international public policy and natural resource management from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in geography from the University of Georgia. He currently serves as president of the American Association of Geographers and previously sat on the scientific advisory panel to the United States Committee on World Food Security. His presentation tonight is titled Decolonizing African Agriculture. Let's extend a warm welcome to Bill Moseley. And what I'd also like to say is that the Grand Rapids Community College, Gamma Theta Upsilon chapter, would like to award Dr. Moseley with the GRCC Geography Field Cap Award in recognition of his stellar field work in Africa. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Mike.
Take it away.
So thank you very much, Mike and Erica, for those very kind words in the introduction, and to the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. My wife participates in Great Decisions, and I have just a lot of respect for this program and its desire to educate the public on international issues. It's also wonderful to be back in the great state of Michigan. As was mentioned, I went to grad school in Ann Arbor. I know that's a divisive topic here, but if Gerald Ford went there, you got to respect U of M in this particular space. My father-in-law also grew up in the UP in St. Ignace, Michigan, and as a consequence, I have a lot of extended family in the region. What I want to do today is really give you an outline of a book that was published a little over a year ago, has the same title as this talk, and the book is really my attempt to take a step back from a 35-year career, initially as an international development worker, mostly working in Africa for about 10 years, and then 25 years as an academic. And to try to make sense of what I think is working and what's not working in terms of African agricultural development and food security. And hopefully, in the process, provoke policymakers into considering some alternatives. And this book project is different than other things I've written. Most things I write are for academic audiences, and on a good day, maybe 2 or 3 people read these things, other specialists in the world. But this particular book I tried to write it in a very accessible way, not dumbing anything down, but using more straightforward language. A lot of it's in narrative style, lots of it is in first person. And you can get the book from Columbia University Press, or you can download it for free. So just Google the title and you can find it online. I also thought it might be good to just say a few things about geography. You might be wondering, what's the connection between this book and my talk today and geography? And geography is, we're very interested in spatial patterns. We're often known for maps and certain types of technologies, GIS, remote sensing, GPS. But for us, the spatial patterns are just a starting point. We're really interested in explaining those patterns. And also very much at the core of geography is thinking about humans' relationship to the environment, both how we're impacting the environment and how the environment is impacting us. And if you think about that, one of the most intimate ways that we interact with our environment is through food production, right? If you had breakfast or lunch or even dinner today, you've already impacted, the environment, whether you know it or not. So there's been this long tradition of geographers studying agricultural issues. Just a couple of other caveats before I get started. So I'm going to be talking about African agriculture, food security. I'm not African, right? I didn't grow up on the continent. I bring a set of life experiences that are different from someone who did. And while I've lived for 10 to 12 years in a variety of different African countries, I often did so as a privileged outsider. The other caveat I want to make is that I very much understand that African policymakers do not operate in a vacuum. They're operating in this sort of policy ecosystem that includes other governments, UN institutions, bilateral donors, universities, and I've worked for many of those organizations. And so those work experiences have obviously impacted the way I think about these issues. And what you're going to discover is that I'm often quite critical of the work that they have done. But the point I want to make is I realize that these are not homogeneous institutions. There's good people that work in them. You know, they mean well. And oftentimes, because of the constraints they're operating under, you know, or the way they were educated, it doesn't turn out the way they wanted it to. And I have very much been in their shoes. I have made all the same type of mistakes. So, on with the talk, right? So I'm going to start by talking about the origins of my thinking for this project. Then I'm going to spend some time presenting my major argument or my thesis. This rests on kind of 4 theoretical pillars. I'll explain those a little bit. Then I'm going to talk really big picture about sort of global and African food security and the sort of current state of affairs. And then I'm going to drill down on 4 particular countries where I've spent the majority of my career working: Mali and Burkina Faso in West Africa, Botswana and South Africa in Southern Africa. I'm going to show you what's been going wrong. And then, because I don't want to leave you all depressed, I'm going to show you some signs of hope, some experiments that point the way forward. At the end, I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to talk about international institutions, and then I'll conclude. But what I want to do is start this talk with the story. And it's a story that I use in the book to help you understand how I arrived at this particular topic and why I decided to write a whole book about it, right? So I served as a US Peace Corps volunteer in the 1980s in Mali in West Africa. I was an agricultural volunteer. I was sent to promote gardening, locally appropriate food crops, and I went through several months of training, and then I got sent out to a small community of 200 people in the southern part of the country. And there I met my government counterpart, who is the local agricultural extension agent. And I think he found my interest in vegetable production sort of quaint, because what he was focused on was the real business of producing cash crops, and in particular, cotton. And every month, I would go to these meetings with all the other ag extension agents in the region, and I couldn't figure out at first why the only crop we ever talked about was cotton, including these sort of endless discussions about cotton quotas. And I thought I was working for the Ministry of Agriculture. It turns out I was working for the Ministry of Cotton. That's a joke, by the way, all right? So I would subsequently come to understand that Mali had signed agreements with the World Bank in the aftermath of becoming indebted. They went through neoliberal economic reform, also known as structural adjustment, but in exchange for those loans, they had to implement certain policies. And one of the commitments they made was that they had to focus on cotton production for export, because this was a crop for which Mali was deemed to have a comparative advantage. And as a result of those efforts, there are several points in the 1990s when Mali becomes the top producer of cotton in all of Africa. So I would return to Mali in the 1990s, both to do my master's thesis research, to do my dissertation research. And I got very interested in cotton after this Peace Corps experience. I remember interviewing a large number of civil servants. This was in French, that's the administrative, also the colonial language. And they would tell me, grâce à la CMDT, nos fonctionnaires sont payés. Because of the government cotton company, our civil servants are paid. Or when I was talking to the ag extension agents that worked in the local language Bambara, which I also speak, they would say, Kori tigiye, nyo tigiye. It was this idea that the big cotton producers are also the big food crop producers. And it was true that cotton production was helping the government of Mali meet their financial obligations, but it was also leading many farmers to become indebted. It was not resulting in poverty alleviation, and it was undermining, it was destroying the soil. And my subsequent research would also show that these supposed synergies between cash crop and food crop production weren't true. They were only true for the wealthiest of farmers, but for the middle income and the poor farmers, that wasn't working out. So this leads me to my sort of central conundrum. How is it that civil servants, in this case largely trained in crop science or agronomy, were dispensing advice that was not good for those farmers? And the answer I'm going to suggest is that the science of agronomy is not apolitical, but it's infused with power and politics. In other words, it can be argued that agronomists have focused on developing specific types of crops with certain types of characteristics for the benefit of certain entities and groups of people. And all of these breeding decisions have been affected by those who hold power. And so part of my argument here is that we cannot begin to change African agriculture to make it more focused on delivering healthy food to disadvantaged people until we understand that dynamic, the influence of these ideas. And so my central thesis has 3 parts. The first is that we're only going to seriously address hunger in Africa when we more fully question the assumption that increased crop production alone is the solution. And up here on the right, I have this 6-dimensional understanding of food security. We have historically, in addressing hunger globally, only focused on one of the 6 dimensions, production or availability. We have ignored access. Do poor people have access to that food? We have ignored stability, the stability of food prices over time. We have ignored utilization, which has to do you have proper sanitation and cooking facilities to prepare healthy and nutritious food? We have largely ignored sustainability, and we have largely ignored agency, people's control over their food systems. And so part of my argument here is that we need to think more broadly, just not narrowly on production. Second part of my thesis, that agricultural development must be seen as the first step in an must be seen as more than the first step in an industrial development process. And if you look in both the West and the East, agriculture is often framed as something that needs to be developed so that we can do something else. And so some of you may be familiar with modernization theory, Rostow's stages of economic growth. He argues that the first step is you need to take subsistence agriculture and commercialize it so that you can produce capital that can then be invested into industrialization. Or if you look at the Chinese firing from the bottom strategy, same thing. You develop agriculture so you can develop industry. So it's a step to something else. And what I'm arguing is that we need to think about agriculture as a sustainable livelihood in and of itself, not as a step to something else. And then the fourth part of my thesis is that an agroecological approach, and I'm going to talk about that a lot later, combined with good governance, will allow people to have greater control over their food systems, produce healthy food more sustainably, and enhance access to food by the poorest of the poor. So in the book, there's sort of 4 key conversations or concepts that I use to sort of guide my analysis throughout the book. And the first is this idea of intellectual colonization and decolonization. And there are many scholars that have looked at different disciplines, and what they've shown is that oftentimes core assumptions of those disciplines date back to the colonial period. And oftentimes they were based on shaky science or racial prejudice, or this idea that the European experience could be extrapolated to other parts of the world, or those assumptions were based on doing things that benefited the colonial empire. And while those assumptions might be wrong or inaccurate, they have often persisted over time, and they have not received sufficient scrutiny. And this is a problem in all disciplines, including my own discipline of geography. But I think there are certain applied sciences, and here I'm thinking about forestry, agronomy, public health, water resources management, where this is a particular problem. And it's often because they worked most closely with the colonial enterprise. So this image on the bottom here, this is from the Roads Must Fall demonstrations in South Africa. They happened in 2015. They started at the University of Cape Town campus, and the students wanted to tear down a statue of Cecil Rhodes. And Cecil Rhodes, we often associate in the US with the Rhodes Scholarship. We think of that as a good thing, but he was a huge colonial booster and a very problematic figure. And so this movement really caught the attention of the country and the world, and it led to this growing recognition that higher education in South Africa was deeply colonial. Next, interdisciplinary conversation is political agronomy. And we often think of science as apolitical, but it's important to acknowledge that there are political influences. And so political agronomy, which development-oriented agronomy, which used to be known as tropical agronomy, has its roots in Europe, and it was driven by this need of the colonial powers to capture and modify tropical crops, soils, and farming practices as a fuel for European economic expansion. So they literally went in and changed the way African farming systems were working to benefit the core countries, and in many instances, those assumptions really haven't changed over time. Next interdisciplinary conversation is political ecology, which is a broader interdisciplinary field. Lots of anthropologists, geographers, political scientists are active in this area. And there are three aspects of political ecology that are really useful for analyzing these sorts of issues. One is a multi-scalar approach. And so if you think about a farmer, for example, and they're managing their farm field, they don't exist in a vacuum, right? They're influenced by national policies, regional trading relationships, the programs of international organizations. We all know this. We don't just willy-nilly, farmers in this region decide to grow corn and soybeans. That's deeply influenced by a subsidy program. Second aspect of political ecology that's important is to understand that people's experience of the environment is influenced by political economy. And let me give you an example of this. In the West African Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, drought is a regular occurrence. Well, historically, you had livelihood systems that were well adapted to that particular environmental context. Farmers had grain reserves. It was a bad year. They would fall back on those reserves. But during the colonial period and the post-colonial period, farmers were encouraged to focus on production, to stop saving reserves. Sometimes this was influenced by a policy known as a head tax, where you had to pay this in cash. And so they stopped having grain reserves. And now they feel the full brunt of that drought. So your experience, right, is of this natural occurrence is influenced by the organization of society. And the last piece of this is a focus on socially constructed roles. In this context in particular, gender roles. Men and women in rural areas of Africa often have different sets of responsibility. And so women, they have to collect firewood. And if there's deforestation, they're going to feel that differently than men do. Or if women have to collect water and the water table is dropping and they have to spend more time getting water, they're going to experience that differently than men do. The last kind of idea that I'm really drawing on for this work is agroecology. Agroecologists think about a farm field like a modified ecosystem. Humans are managing it to produce certain types of crops. And what agroecologists argue is that if you study the ecological interactions between different crops, crops and insects, crops and the soil, you can leverage positive synergies to produce more food sustainably. So let me give you a couple of specific examples of this. This is intercropping, all right? A lot of African farmers mix multiple crops in the same field. In this field, we have cowpeas, or sometimes known as black-eyed peas in this area. This is a legume. It fixes nitrogen that then is used by the grain crop. It looks like corn, but it's actually sorghum. So they facilitate each other's growth. They mature at different times, so they spread out labor demands because the harvest times are different, and a lot of African farming systems are labor constrained. Also, when you have multiple crops in the same field, you tend to have fewer insect predation problems. Agroforestry down on the bottom here is the mixing of trees and crops in the same field. We've done some of this in the United States in the 30s. After the Dust Bowl, people started planting windbreaks around farm fields, but African farmers for a very long time keep certain trees that have ecological or economic advantages in their farm field. So this is what is known as a parkland agroforestry system. This particular species is Acacia albida. It's a legume. It fixes nitrogen, which benefits the grain crop. This is a tropical savanna landscape. There's a long dry season. There's a short rainy season. It loses its leaves during the rainy season, so it doesn't compete with the crops for sunlight. But during that long dry season, it leaves out and it protects the soil from solar radiation. Also, because the trees are spread through the field, it slows down wind speed and you get less windborne soil erosion. And it produces these pods that you can feed to animals. So there's lots of advantages to this. And so agroecologists, right, are building on these traditional practices. Agroecology is also a social movement. And when I originally learned about agroecology at the University of Michigan, I very much thought of it as a science. I was kind of resistant to the social movement piece. But what I have come to understand is that if you are looking for a paradigm shift in science, and that's what I'm calling for here, it's really helpful to have a social movement behind you. And I'm going to give you a specific example of this at the end of the talk. The last thing I'll say about agroecology, in the book, I argue that it's a more decolonial approach. Traditional agronomy, we run experiments on field stations. We come up, with the best type of seed or plant that we need. Agroecologists think of farmers as scientists. Farmers are constantly experimenting in their farm fields, trying to come up with the best strategies, and they have informal knowledge or experiential knowledge. And so agroecologists work with that knowledge, they work with farmers, and also do formal science that we're familiar with in the university. So it's a bridging of these two forms of knowledge. All right, big picture, 2015, UN Sustainable Development Goals. Second goal was zero hunger by 2030. We have been moving in the wrong direction. Hunger has actually gotten worse, not better, since 2015. So about 1 in 10 people in the world today are hungry. The largest number of hungry people are found in South Asia, but as a proportion of the population, the largest proportion is found in the African context. So this bar graph here, 2015, about 45% of the African population suffered from moderate to severe food insecurity. That is almost up to 60% by today. So we are moving in the wrong direction. Big picture, what I and co-authors have argued is that historically, every time there has been a global food crisis, we have tended to respond with a productionist response. So if we go back to the 60s and 70s, we're concerned about overpopulation, we're concerned about not enough food. We respond with the Green Revolution, which is pushing out this industrial food production model to the global south. Then in the late 1970s, we have the third world debt crisis. I referenced this in my story earlier. The response there is neoliberal economic reform and this real big focus on exports. We're going to move away from food self-sufficiency. We're going to produce crops for export. Then we have another food crisis, 2006, 2007, 2008. And here the response in the African context is the new Green Revolution for Africa, which is a sort of a reboot of that original Green Revolution that's very much focused on African crops. The result has been that we now have a global food system that is dependent on a few major breadbaskets using very energy-intensive food production techniques. Things are being traveling over long distances, and it's very vulnerable to energy price shocks, to a pandemic like we saw during COVID, to conflict and war. So we blow up Ukraine, which is a major breadbasket, and then many people are suffering in other parts of the world, particularly North Africa and East Africa. So let me talk more specifically now about the situation in these 4 countries where I've spent most of my career working. And like any good academic, I can rationalize this sort of random selection of countries. So Mali, Burkina Faso, they're low-income countries, they're former French colonies. Smallholder farming really dominates. We're talking farms of sort of 5 hectares or less. Botswana, South Africa, former British colonies, they're middle-income countries. Botswana is semi-arid. There's a lot of animal husbandry. South Africa, it's a former white settler colony. Commercial agriculture is really big. And what I'm going to show you over these 4 very different countries is that there are some common problems, right? So that's what I'm going to do next. So, Mali. This is where I started with my little story at the beginning. Former French colony, about 20 million people. It's rapidly urbanizing, but it's still a majority rural country, about 70% dependent on agriculture. Major exports are cotton and gold. And really interestingly, cotton, which some of you may know was originally domesticated in Egypt, has been grown in Mali for a very, very long period of time. It has deep roots in the pre-colonial period. And in the pre-colonial period, it was largely women who grew cotton. It was a perennial, not an annual crop. It was grown in small gardens. It was often intercropped with other crops, and they sold the cotton to local weavers. Then France, which is shocked by the American Civil War and a decline in cotton exports to Europe, says we can't depend on the Americans for cotton anymore because of the northern blockade of the southern states. And so it set out to develop export-oriented cotton in its former colonies, including Mali. And so they destroyed the local textile industry. They dumped a lot of cheap textiles there, and they started encouraging export-oriented cotton production. They originally tried to do this along the Niger River, and then in the 1950s, they developed rain-fed cotton varieties. And very interestingly, even though women traditionally grew cotton, they focused on men. Cotton gets framed as this sort of male crop. And the last point I want to make here before I get to the next slide is the Sikasso paradox. This is Sikasso, the southernmost region. It's the wealthiest rural region in the country, and it has the highest rates of child malnutrition, right? And so if you have questions about that, we can talk about it in the Q&A period. The research I've done over many years in Mali showed that the wealthiest households grow the most cotton in a statistically significant way. They tend to use more inorganic fertilizers, and the sustained use of them without adding organic inputs is leading to soil acidification, which is decreasing yields. They also use significantly more pesticides. And what the Malian government has been doing is that, and this is a little hidden behind the podium, but they go from the old cotton basin when yields start to decline to the new cotton basin to the cotton frontier. So they're not addressing these underlying sustainability problems. They're just moving into new regions in order to maintain production. All right, Burkina Faso. Right next door to Mali. It is similar in many ways to Mali, former French colony. Those of you who are older in the room, it used to be known as Upper Volta. Its name changed in the 1980s. Also about 20 million people, also rapidly urbanizing, but still a majority rural country that's highly dependent on agriculture. Its major exports are also gold and cotton. But in Burkina Faso, we focused on rice production, and in particular, a new green revolution for Africa rice production project there. And like Burkina Faso, like its neighbors, as it has very rapidly been urbanizing, as people move into the city, their diets have been changing. They've been moving away from traditional coarse grains, millet, sorghum, and they're consuming more rice. And we've done interviews with households and the women cooks in those households about why. And a lot of it has to do with convenience. They're in urban areas. They don't have as much time. Rice is quicker and easier to cook. But also it's considered to be a sign of modernity. So if you've kind of made it, right, you want to offer rice to your household. So in Burkina Faso, 2007, 2008, global food crisis, rice prices go up 100%. There are food riots. There's a lot of social unrest. And AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which is funded by the Gates Foundation, says we can help you out. We can help you produce more rice in your country because they only produce 25% of their own rice. So they were working, well, first of all, they did surveys, figured out what kind of rice qualities the urban consumers liked. They were replicating those seeds. And then in rural communities, they're leveling farm fields. They're helping build these micro dikes for flooded rice production. Both men and women are involved. And what we found is that we did surveys with the women involved in those projects. And in a statistically significant way, there's no difference between the women who participate in the project and who don't in terms of food security measures, right? And we looked at dietary diversity scores based on 24-hour recall of what they're eating. We looked at something known as a household food insecurity access scale. So it's not improving the situation of women. Again, in the Q&A period, ask about it and I can give you an explanation of why that is. The other thing that is going on in Burkina Faso, which really caught me by surprise initially, is that the vast majority of women farmers are now using herbicides. And when I first started working in this area in the 1980s, that was virtually unheard of. And so I, like a good geographer, I have kind of a multi-scalar explanation for what is going on here. Why has this been this explosion of herbicide use, including amongst women farmers who have the fewest resources? At a global scale, we have Roundup, which is also known as glyphosate, that goes off patent in 2000. And then we begin to see the production of generic herbicides in places like India and in China. So now they're much cheaper. They negotiate access to the West African market by going through a country that has the most lax regulations, and then they can get them to the rest of the whole market. So now we have cheaper herbicides. Then at the kind of mesoscale, the regional scale, increasingly we have labor constraints in rural areas because there has been an explosion of artisanal mine production, artisanal gold production. So there are big industrial gold mines that you may be familiar with. Artisanal gold production is small-scale mining operations, 2-3 people. Increasingly, they're using equipment that comes from China, and they're literally digging holes in the ground and digging up gold. And I've been to some of these gold fields. But they're significant in terms of food production because lots of young people, men and women, are leaving the rural areas to work in these gold mines, and now we have less labor to work on farms. And then at the domestic scale, the household scale, these are large, male-headed households. It's a patriarchal society. Women are farmers, but they don't control the labor in the family, right? But they farm. And they, weeding is a labor-intensive process, and herbicides are a labor-saving technology. So it's a rational decision. It's helping them solve a problem. The problem is glyphosate is a suspected carcinogen. Atrazine is a known hormone disruptor. So the health consequences of this shift are unknown, but probably not good, right? Botswana. Botswana's a big country. It's about the size of Texas. It's one of the least densely populated countries in the world alongside Mongolia. About 2.5 million people. It has rapidly been urbanizing. So now it's a majority urban country. Diets have been changing. Obesity is a growing problem. And they are framed as an African development success story because of this growth curve. So when growth is relatively flat in other sub-Saharan African countries, Botswana is growing wildly. And it has to do with the discovery of diamonds after independence, the wise and shrewd management of that diamond resource. So they're the largest exporter of gem quality diamonds in the world. They also have a high-end ecotourism industry, and they have a well-developed cattle export industry. And as the country has changed, it has become wealthier, but women have really suffered in the process because women are the crop farmers, and that has received less and less attention. And Botswana now imports about 90% of its food. Research we did in Botswana showed that 56% of urban households, 66% of peri-urban households, 76% of rural households suffer from moderate to severe food insecurity. So this is an African development success story. They did everything that experts said they should do. You know, Ricardo, who's this famous economist, argues that you gotta focus on the things for which you have a comparative advantage, in their case, diamonds, tourism, the cattle industry, yet they have this major problem in terms of food insecurity, and women have been marginalized in the process. South Africa, 60 million people, diverse economy. It is also very urban, about 70% urban. Obesity, another form of malnutrition, is a growing problem. After the ANC took power in 1994, Nelson Mandela was president, a big issue was land reform. Blacks had lost land during the apartheid years, and so there's an explicit program to help historically disadvantaged groups get access to land. So that starts under Nelson Mandela. His program is more flexible. You're getting funds to buy land. You can pretty much do whatever you want with that land, smallholder farming, you can build a garage, a summer home, you can do whatever you want. Thabo Mbeki takes over after Mandela, and he's trained as an economist. He's much more concerned about developing commercial agriculture. So now, in order to get land, you have to have a commercial agriculture business plan. And so land reform really shifts. And we looked at a sample of land reform projects in the Western Cape. This is the area around Cape Town in South Africa. They were about 30-some projects that were 3 or more years old. We looked at about half of those. And what we found is that an alarming number of those projects are failing. In some cases, they're going completely out of business, and the land gets sold back to the white farmers that originally sold the land. And the question is why? Some of it has to do with this focus on a very competitive, globalized form of agriculture. You're asking new farmers to enter that very competitive market. Also, their land reform model worked through the market, which meant that the farms that were being sold were more marginal, and it's hard to make a more marginal farm work when you're a new farmer. And oftentimes there were large groups of people running these farms. So that's kind of been depressing. I've gone through 4 different countries. I've showed you all the different problems. So I want to show you now some signs of hope. This will go a bit quicker than the first half. So back in Mali. Remember when I talked about Burkina Faso and I talked about the global food crisis of 2007, 2008, food prices going up, social unrest? That didn't happen in Mali. And the question is why? Very, very serendipitously, just before that global food crisis, cotton farmers in Mali basically revolted and said, we're not going to grow cotton. The global price is too low. We don't want to do that, and we're going to grow sorghum. And so if you look at this graph here, what you see as cotton production is going down, food production is going up. And so when the price of rice went up, urban consumers were able to downshift into this cheaper grain. It's what economists call an inferior good. So this is interesting for several reasons. One is that by producing more of its own food, they averted this global shock and the social unrest related to it. Secondly, while the Malian government had long argued that there are synergies between cash crop and food production, food crop production, what we see here is that when cash crop production goes down, food crop production goes up. The crop that they were growing more of, sorghum, is also better adapted to that climate. It's more drought tolerant. It is also more amenable to intercropping and agroecological approaches. It requires fewer inputs than other crops do. And the last point I'll make is that Mali has recently experienced a lot of insecurity and unrest. And so being dependent on long-range value chains is problematic. And so to have a more decentralized, localized food production system is probably a smarter move. Burkina Faso. In Burkina Faso, I focus on this concept known as a food environment. So a food environment is the area from which you source all of your food. So if I think about my own case, in the summertime, I get some food from my garden. I go to the farmer's market on the weekend. I go to the grocery store. Maybe I wander down the alley and pick some of my neighbor's raspberries. That's my food environment. In a similar way, the women farmers that we were talking to, they were not just getting their food from their farm fields. When they were walking out to the farm field in the morning, when they were walking back in the evening, they were foraging along the way. And they were collecting berries, they were collecting wild vegetables, leaves from trees, which were a really important part of their diet, which actually were coming out at a time of year that we call the hungry season. So if you think about, if you're a farmer, you're a subsistence farmer, you're producing ideally 12 months of food for your household. If you only produce 9 or 10 months, you have this stretch until the next harvest that's really difficult when you're rationing out food. And this is when a lot of the wild foods flower out and people start to collect them. So just a couple of examples of these types of foods, which nearly all the women were collecting. Baobab, you may be familiar with an African baobab tree and its silhouette, Addissonia digitata. It has these dark green leaves that are really rich in iron that you can work into the sauce that you eat with your carbohydrate as part of the meal. Or Parcla bigliobosa, also known as the African locust bean or nere. They ferment it, and it turns into something known as sumbala that they work into their sauces. And it's rich in iron, zinc, potassium, and magnesium. And so these are the nutrition-dense parts of meals, and they're really important, and they're coming from foraging. And a broader conception of the food environment. Botswana. Botswana, like I said, it's considered to be an African development success story, but the way development has happened has often favored males over females. There was this experiment in 2008. The former president, Ian Khama, had this backyard gardening initiative. Women are very involved in gardening. It's a little hard to see, but this woman gardener behind the text here, she has shade netting. So they were giving shade netting to the farmers to cut down on evapotranspiration. They were helping them have rooftop rainfall collection. They were giving them cisterns to collect water. They were giving them gardening implements. And the government, I was there in 2015 with a student. We were analyzing this program, and they considered it to be a failure. It wasn't working out, mostly because they were thinking about it in commercial terms. And what we discovered is that actually access to water is critical. And while the government sinks lots of boreholes for the cattle industry, which is male-dominated, they were reluctant to do this same thing for women gardeners. Well, we looked at different types of farmers. Some are getting their water from the tap, some are getting it from the river, some invest in a borehole, and their food insecurity is less for the river water and the borehole water. And what's really interesting is that if you're getting river water, which is essentially free, the more food you keep, right, the better your food security is. The others have to be more commercially oriented to pay for the water. And then lastly, in South Africa, they have largely focused on large-scale commercial agriculture in their land reform program. In a few instances, they have broken up larger farms into smaller parcels. My students and I have studied those. The food security outcomes have been better. We've also looked at instances where people have had access to land for a long period of time. So in the Western Cape, there are mission stations, which are run by the Moravian Church. they had access to land, and there's a very lively smallholder agricultural sector there, and they have good food security outcomes. So small scale ag, which is kind of this dirty word in African ag circles, is actually better for food security. So the last thing I'm going to do here in my last couple minutes is zoom out and think internationally about institutions. And I talked a little bit about the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was supported by a series of international institutions, heavily by the FAO and the UN system, but also the CIGAR Research Institute. So the Collaborative Group for International Agricultural Research has research stations all over the world. And if we're going to get a paradigm shift, I think we need another set of institutions that would support an alternative like agroecology. And in the book, I talk about a particular forum where alternative paradigms have been able to emerge, to have a more participatory science. So I don't know how many of you are UN geeks, but in Rome, there's the Committee on World Food Security that coordinates policy between the three Rome-based UN organizations, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the WFP, the World Food Program, and IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And historically, there were sort of member states who sat on the Committee on World Food Security. It underwent an important set of reforms in 2009, and they began to allow civil society organizations to participate in those debates. They also created a scientific arm known as the High-Level Panel of Experts for Food Security and Nutrition, which some people considered to be the IPCC for food. And so what happens is, this Committee on World Food Security requests that a report be written. It gets developed by this group of scientists. They debate that report. Well, actually, before the report gets to the committee, it goes out for public comment. It goes out for peer review. It's a very participatory process. Then it's debated in this body. They adopt policy recommendations that different countries can implement, but also discursively, it influences the way the UN thinks about these issues. And so, full disclosure here, I worked for this group, so I'm biased, right? Lo and behold, 2019, the High-Level Panel of Experts for Food Security and Nutrition requests that a report be written on agroecology. And so this very marginal science that I originally studied at the University of Michigan is now getting a UN report produced on it. It gets debated, they have voluntary guidelines, but more importantly, discursively, it becomes a thing in the UN. The agroecology is a real alternative. Now, this didn't go unnoticed. In 2021, there was a UN Food Systems Summit in New York. The sort of corporate agriculture sector was very upset about what was happening with agroecology, and basically they tried to marginalize the HLPE and the CFS. They were unsuccessful because of civil society. And so this group really protested, said you can't marginalize this group, and it didn't happen. Their plans were kind of foiled. So I'll end, this is how I end the book, with a theory of change, because I am interested in a paradigm shift, because the existing paradigm, I would argue, might be helping us produce a lot of food, or a lot of crops, but it's not addressing food insecurity. So you start with the status quo, production agriculture. I think it's very helpful to have a crisis, like a global food crisis. It leads people to question the dominant paradigm. Then if you have a critique of that model, if you have a viable alternative like agroecology, if that is supported by social movements, very importantly, I think you need institutional allies. You need allies within government, you need allies within major institutions, and you can then see a shift. So I'm gonna stop there. I'm happy to take any of your questions. If you're interested in a free copy of the book, you can get it online. But as I mentioned, you can also get it from Columbia University Press. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. Fascinating. I appreciate it very much. I hope you all did too. It's time for you to engage with Bill on the topics that he presented. If you'd like to text your question, it's 616-308-6560. If you'd rather text your question, 616-308-6560. You know our house rules. You ask a succinct question very respectfully. So let's engage Bill. Does anybody have a question right there?
On your last point about your allies that are needed, who are they and are you finding them? Or who's finding the allies?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think one of the challenges in this case is this problem of intellectual colonization. So if you think about African ministries of agriculture, many of the people high up in those organizations either went to school in Europe or went to school in the United States. They studied at universities like in my state, the University of Minnesota, and they learned about production agriculture. And so for them, that's their worldview. If the Gates Foundation comes along and AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, that's consistent with their worldview, and they're totally on board with that. I think things are slowly beginning to change. There are cases, for example, in Senegal, the Minister of Agriculture there, who was trained in conventional agronomy, after 40 years working, decided that this is not working, right? It's not addressing the food insecurity of my people. And so he's really changed what's been going on in Senegal. I think other parts of this, part of building allies is to start training people differently and to expose them to different models, both at agricultural schools in the United States, but also in the African context. So thank you for your question. Yeah.
Hi. Since you offered the opportunity earlier, I am really curious to see why in Mali, in the richest or the wealthiest rural area, why was the child, rate of hunger so high?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I can offer you 3 hypotheses, and I'm not 100% sure which is the answer. First of all, these are male-dominated households, and if you're shifting from a subsistence food production system to more of a cash crop-oriented system, and that money is going to males in the family, they may decide to spend it on other priorities than food, right? I think also, interestingly, even women, I think women farmers, if presented with tough choices where, what am I going to do with this money? Am I going to buy medicine for my kid, or am I going to buy healthy food? That could be difficult. Whereas historically, you just produced the healthy food, it was a traditional diet, and it was there. And so I think with a cash economy, there's now tension between these different choices that didn't exist, right? So it could just be men and their thoughtless behavior, right? Or I think, these could be real challenges for any head of a household. The other thing that's really interesting is that as cash crop farming and cotton production took off, people started growing more maize, because maize has been bred to be more responsive to inorganic fertilizers in a way that sorghum and millet haven't. The traditional coarse grains have a higher protein content than maize, and so the food system has changed. It's a less nutritious diet than it used to be because of this shift in the farming system. But a really good question. Exactly, yes. And so we often talk about 3 forms of malnutrition. There's absolute caloric deficiency, which is what we usually focus on. But just as important are micronutrient deficiencies, having a diverse diet with key components, and also obesity is a form of malnutrition.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
As you're talking about alternative ideas and making things work, when you're looking for financial support, have you seen any microloans that people are talking about? Have you seen any of that in action, and has that been effective?
So microcredit, so you may be familiar with the Green Grameen Bank model that was originally developed in Bangladesh. And that led to this explosion of microcredit all around the world and across different African countries. I think the really interesting thing about microcredit is it doesn't necessarily help the poorest of the poor, right? I think it helps some poor households do better, invest in small businesses, and then they take off. But what they found with the poorest of the poor is that people are really afraid of defaulting, and in these microcredit models, there's a huge emphasis and social pressure and shame related to not paying the loans back. And so I think we have to acknowledge there are structural conditions that a credit-based approach cannot address. And so I think there's a lot of work in this area, there's a lot of good work, but I don't think it works for all types of households.
Hi, hello, over here. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
A question, so Peace Corps Mauritania,
Awesome.
1991 to 94.
Okay.
I had it a little rougher up there. Mali had beer. You guys were lucky. So my question.
Very true. I heard there was one place for beer in Mauritania, which was like an American embassy bar, but I don't know if that's true.
Yeah. So we tried to make our own, but that never worked. My question is, so yeah, I was an agricultural extension agent, then I went public health, and I worked across Africa in development as well, just like you. In the last, I don't know, dozen or so years, the development science has shifted to localization, right? How does that fit with agroecology? And then my other question is, part of your theory is good governance.
Yeah.
That's big. That's enormous. I'm wondering how you're going to tackle that. That's policy, yeah?
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know if your thesis is too large, but yeah, those are my two questions. So localization and then good governance.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just for the broader audience, localization is you're sort of trying to work with local organizations to implement projects. So, I mean, this started several decades ago. USAID basically shifts from being an implementing agency to a donor agency, and they're oftentimes giving grants to NGOs, sometimes big international NGOs, and they're in turn giving grants to smaller local organizations. In general, I think it's better to work with local organizations that have deep roots in the community. I think we also have to be a little cautious about always assuming that all NGOs are going to be more efficient. And I've seen cases where they work great, and I've also seen cases where they don't work great. Governance, I think we all saw that during COVID, it was important to have a robust safety net. And agroecology, I think, is a very decentralized approach. It can be bottom up, but it also needs support from higher levels. And if we're talking about emergency situations where there's a drought or we have a pandemic, I think we need some level of safety nets, and that requires a level of good governance. And I do not explore that deeply in the book. I just acknowledge that it's important, and that's not my realm of expertise for solving that problem. But I think it's important. I recognize that it's important.
Hi there. Thank you for being here this evening, right back here. So you talked about the decisions that a lot of the women farmers made in these different countries in response to situations, but also the either governmental or NGO activities at the higher level. What did you learn about how and the women farmers or other farmers gained the knowledge that they need or what they acted on in order to change what they were doing? Because it sounds like it's a lot of small farming operations. Just curious about how that happens. Sounds very decentralized. Curious.
So I would argue that a lot of traditional African farming practices are ecologically sensible and they're grounded in place and they make sense. I think we also have to recognize that in the colonial and the post-colonial period, farmers were repeatedly told that what they were doing was backward and primitive. That intercropping, and I showed you all the ecological, economic benefits of that, agroforestry, were different than European systems, and they were basically told, don't do that, and get with the program and participate more in production agriculture. And so that is a problem of kind of the colonization of the mind. And I have done a lot of research with local farmers. Part of what I'm trying to understand is their farm management system, but also, in many cases, I am validating their knowledge. And we might think that's trivial, but I think it's really important if someone takes the care and the time to talk to you and try to understand the way you think about agriculture in this case and validates that, that can be an empowering process. And so I think that's really critical, but then creating opportunities where you can build on that traditional knowledge, because agroecology is not just traditional farming. They're not synonymous. It's about taking those things and building on them and making them better. And so I think we need ag extension agents, we need NGOs that are working with farmers to improve these agroecological methods. And so I briefly mentioned education earlier, but I think African agricultural schools, in addition to teaching production agriculture, need to teach other models like agroecology so that when these ag extension agents go out into the community, they can work with different types of farmers and have a healthy respect for local knowledge. And unfortunately, I think there's been a deficit of respect, right? And that's really important. Webster? Webster's a former student of mine. He drove all the way up here from Chicago.
Hello. It is lovely to be here. Thank you, Bill, for the talk. And I feel like I've learned a lot already. I cling to your words a lot and have for many years. So you said that it is important during a paradigm shift to have and it can be helpful to have a social movement along with the paradigm shift. I am curious, when I leave this auditorium and go out into the world, what social movements would you suggest supporting to help the paradigm shift? And I think you touched on a lot of them. Gender equality seemed like a major issue, environmental rights. So it may be straightforward, but I just wanted to hear from you what the social environment is like.
Yeah. So let me talk globally and then more specifically about the US. So globally, there is an international food sovereignty movement via Campesina. Some of you may be familiar with it. It has roots in the Latin American context, but there was also a really important conference in southern Mali in 2007. It led to something known as the Nyalini Declaration. And there's a beautiful story about, in traditional folklore, Nyalini was this female farmer who basically was better than all the male farmers in her village, right? And so the declaration is named after her, but it's a statement about African food sovereignty. And I do think that social movement and bringing farmers on board with that is important for a paradigm shift. The United States is, our agricultural system is broken. Some of you in this room might disagree with me, but we are good at producing a lot of stuff, right? If I think about my state of Minnesota, 95% of what is produced in Minnesota is not consumed directly by humans, right? It goes to make ethanol, it goes to make high fructose corn syrup, and it is destroying the environment. We're flushing soil resources, in the case of my state, down the Mississippi River, which is leading to this dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And when I go out and talk to farmers, and my classes visit, usually in the fall, we visit farms, and I'm always struck by when we visit the conventional farms, they are really struggling. Oftentimes they have a family member who's working off farm because they just can't pay the bills. They're highly leveraged, they have all this equipment, they have to pay down this debt, and like they're lucky if they break even. And then in the same visit, we go visit a little CSA vegetable farm. They're farming, 10, 12 acres of land, and I don't know if you're familiar with CSA agriculture, community supported agriculture. People pay a certain amount of money up front, and then every week you get a box of vegetables. It's a way to mitigate risk, because if there's seasonal fluctuation, the farmer doesn't bear all that risk. But the CSA farmers we visit, they're not indebted. I'm thinking of one farmer in particular. It's a man and wife and their 3 kids, and they're doing just fine. So there's like this little farm which is doing pretty well, right? And then I compare it to this big farm, which, they have millions of dollars in equipment, but they're on the verge of going bankrupt. So something is fundamentally wrong, and I think we really need to change ag policy in the United States. We need a social movement to push Congress to think about changing that system. And very interestingly, it's harder for me to imagine that in the United States than it is internationally, because we really haven't gotten close to shifting that in the United States. All right. Thank you. Good question. Yeah.
Right here. This may be more of a question on micro versus the macro that you've talked about, but I did not hear anything about it. There seems to be an aggressive uptick in killings, like jihadist or insurgent killings, and a lot of the victims are farmers in the countries that you talked about. Is that play any kind of a role? Is that now kind of a new problem that's forming? I don't know how long that's actually been going on. We don't hear much about it here.
Yeah. So people who follow West African politics may know that Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger have formed this new organization of African states. So part of this is, they're trying to break away from France, but they all suffer from these jihadist insurgencies. Many of them have had multiple military coups in recent years. And I think it has to do with the army's frustration that they're not being successful combating the Islamist insurgents in their country. And so if they take over the government, somehow they're going to do better. And so they've kicked out the French. In many instances, they've hired the Wagner Group, which are these Russian missionaries. And they are still struggling to contain that insurgency. and we could talk all night about this, but the rebels recently have started blockading Bamako, and they're not letting fuel trucks come into Bamako. And you have a few militants off in the hills that are basically, they've got these big missile launchers and they blow up fuel trucks, and if it's a caravan, like the whole caravan goes up. So this is a serious problem. In terms of agriculture, it's more of a problem for pastoralists. So in this part of the Sahel, these dry tropical grasslands, you have transhumant pastoralists who move over big areas, and now their areas are restricted. But also, cattle on the hoof is a high value target. I mean, they're not going to waste their time collecting some sorghum, right? They're more interested in a fat cow, right? So it has been more of a problem for the pastoralists than the farmers. But a really good question.
One last question.
Well, maybe this is a good last question. To get maybe more specific on your answer to your former student.
Yeah.
If we're on board with what you're saying, when we walk out of here, who do we write to? Who do we call? What do we do to help this along?
Yeah. So
you have a mailing list.
So I can't speak for you personally, but in general, I think within the farming community and within broad swaths of the American public, we feel like American agriculture is the best agriculture on the planet. We're the most productive agriculture, and we're feeding the world, right? If I think about Minnesota and the pride of being a farmer there, there's this idea that we're feeding the world. You know, Norman Borlaug, who came from Iowa, is the father of the Green Revolution, and if you've been to the U.S. Capitol, each state has two statues in the U.S. Capitol, and one of Iowa's is Norman Borlaug. So we celebrate production agriculture in the United States. We celebrate people like Norman Borlaug, and I think we're reluctant to realize that just producing more is not going to solve the problem. In many cases, we need to help it's the poorest of the poor that are food insecure, and we need to help them get better access to food. And so I wish I had a better answer to your question, but I think it's writing to your congresspeople and, you know, I think articulating that the current subsidy system is not working. Now, we are in a crisis right now, and I argue that crises are an opportunity for change. Whether you support the current president or not, he has basically shut down agricultural exports. So we grow a lot of soybeans in Minnesota, and they can't sell them. They're sitting in silos, and this is a major, major problem for farmers. And so maybe this is an opportunity, if there was some government assistance to help people make a transition to a more diverse form of agriculture that's more focused on feeding people in this country than exporting things or turning them into ethanol or turning them into high fructose corn syrup. So I think it's putting pressure on the politicians, but maybe thinking about this particular moment of crisis and how that could be a moment for change. Because any farmer I talk to these days, even big supporters of the current president, are not at all happy with, they realize that this is a terrible situation they're in. The one exception is the producers of beef cattle, because the prices are high for them, yeah.
Let's thank Bill for leading us this conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bill. Appreciate it.